Welcome, and I would like to start out by introducing myself, certainly, and I'm going to spend the first several minutes giving you a bit of context and background before we dive into talking actual strategies and principles. Um, which I know people like to get to as quickly as possible. But I do want to start with giving you a little bit of background on myself and my thinking, as well as this topic more generally. Um, Before I say anything more, again, I mentioned this before, feel free to, I'm going to ask you to share, think about, reflect on, share some of your own thoughts and ideas, certainly questions which we can save till the end and do kind of a Q&A. But I would love for participants in the future watching this webinar to have the benefit of, you know, participants today, your questions and your thoughts and my sort of response to that. So we can do it throughout as well. I have the chat box open here, so if anything's coming to mind, feel free to just type in a thought or a question. I'm happy to pause and do that. I'm not used to just sitting in front of a computer and just talking. Usually when I teach, I'm in front of a group and there's a lot of interaction and discussion. And so I'm trying to integrate a little bit of that in whatever way I can today. So we're going to do a little bit of just sort of hearing from you and bouncing ideas off of each other. Um, so my name is Susanna Gallor. A lot of people call me Susie. Most people call me Susie. I'm currently a faculty member at the at the University of Massachusetts Boston in the psychology department. I also am a faculty member in the clinical psychology doctoral program, where I supervise and train doctoral students. And I've been here for about 5 years now. Prior to being at UMass Boston, I was primarily a clinician, a therapist. I was trained as a counseling psychologist and have worked in several college counseling centers specifically. So I have a lot of experience in college mental health. And I had a private practice as well before I joined the faculty at UMass Boston. So this is relevant in that I started to develop a sense of, what it meant to practice from a social justice perspective, in a clinical sense. It started, and I'm going to get into some of these definitions. It started more around developing multicultural counseling competencies, which was a real emphasis, certainly in my training and my program. And it's a real emphasis in counseling psychology as well as clinical psychology in general. And I observed and experienced, just want to make sure, I just got a notice that my network wasn't working, but I think it's still working okay. I noticed in general that, or I observed and experienced that, you know, becoming multiculturally competent and sensitive wasn't enough, and it was different to think about some of the same issues and work I was doing with not only clients but also trainees and supervision from a social justice perspective. It's a little different than multicultural competency and sensitivity. So we're going to get into those distinctions as well. But I found that it applied almost equally. Um, it applied almost equally in a teaching context. So, a lot of that informed what I did as a teacher, as a professor, as an educator, my clinical background. So, what it meant to do social justice competent counseling is kind of the background of what I think about being a social justice oriented psychology professor, educator, thinking about research and specifically undergraduate psychology education and research. Um, here's a quote in the spirit of having a social justice orientation. You might not think about Albert Einstein as a social justice warrior. I've heard that term as well. But I think this quote sets a little bit of the background that I want to get into. The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. So I'm going to talk a lot about perspective and how, and at the end, we're going to talk about stories and how there's a danger in just having a single story. There's a lot you lose in just seeing things from your perspective alone, or one perspective. You sort of lose a lot there. So my efforts throughout the webinar is to have you engage, reflect, offer your own insights and perspectives. I think you'll sort of, if you haven't already thought about a lot of these things, you'll understand them more if you think about where you're coming from and how that might be a little different than where I'm coming from, or where some of these ideas are going. I'm going to be asking you to just reconsider traditional concepts and viewpoints from different perspectives, expand your mind, think of teaching and research and practice, to think of them in less traditional ways, and in sort of a more kind of progressive, social justice oriented way. So on that note, again, as by way of background, and why I think this topic is important, as I'm sure you already know, or I imagine a lot of you already know of this and can relate to this, or else you wouldn't have come to see this webinar. As most of you know, we've thought about, and we know that we live in an increasingly diverse and global society. Psychology, the field of psychology, we get that, we know that. Even more specifically, it's been very well documented that across the country we have an increasingly diverse student body in higher education. I believe, and I think many scholars have discussed and shown, that people can't be understood independently from their social contexts. Psychology as a discipline can't be learned without examining knowledge and experience within a historical, political, cultural, and social context. Having a social justice-oriented approach to education, particularly in psychology, is broadly an effort to challenge the context-free notions of traditional, again, I keep mentioning that word because I don't think this is true in all, certainly institutions and programs, and, courses across psychology across the United States, in North America. But traditionally, we think of context-free psychological functioning, and I do think that continues to dominate the field. So what we're trying to do is challenge that context-free notion, that it's not necessarily accurate, it's not necessarily productive, it's not, we're missing a lot by not acknowledging that this is not a value neutral science, in the way that other sciences are. So I think it's our responsibility to acknowledge that, certainly, and to develop new ways of teaching psychology to undergraduate students, of researching psychological phenomenon. I almost see it as an ethical responsibility, not just as a therapist anymore, which is what it felt like to me, but also, as you know, the American Psychological Association Code of Ethics instructs psychologists in various roles that you might find yourself to not unfairly single out, discriminate, intentionally, certainly harm people based on age, gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic status, or any basis prescribed by law. This is absolutely a foundational principle within our field. So of course we want to minimize and address harm, um, you know, whether or not we intentionally or unintentionally cause it. In the higher education context, discrimination, harassment, harm relate to access and the opportunity to learn in a non-hostile environment. So it's our ethical responsibility just to have spaces and classrooms and settings and labs that provide equitable opportunities for all students to participate and learn. So this is one aspect of having a social justice approach and one part of our ethical responsibility. But specific to psychology undergraduate instruction and learning, the APA ethics codes, also require psychologists to respect and protect civil and human rights. We share this commitment with lots of allied professions like social work, medicine, sociology, political science, public health. But the field of psychology has a checkered human rights history, with theory, research, and practices reinforcing and lending credibility to discriminatory practices against historically marginalized groups. So the quote you see here, I think, adds the social justice element to this clear commitment that we have, given our history and given all the progress we've made in the field, to multiculturalism. So we'll talk more about the distinction between multiculturalism and social justice in a minute, but this quote here by Wayne Dykstra, I think, is a great, again, context for this. Psychology is an ethical political endeavor. Its practices are influenced by and influence our societies. Knowledge gained about learning directly impacts a child's experience in school. How we interpret depression and other mental health symptoms leads to the development of interventions undertaken by millions. The fact that psychology has such an immediate role in our societies impresses upon us the need to develop a form of praxis that is acutely aware of this responsibility. So with that in mind, let's take a step back and start with exploring our and the literature's thoughts on what social justice even means. So if you can, take a moment to consider your own perspective. How do you define social justice? What are the elements you believe are included in having a social justice approach in your teaching, in your research, in your mentoring, or if you're a student yourself, in the experiences you've had in class, with mentors, with supervisors, with professors? What does social justice mean to you? How would you even think about what a social justice approach means? And I guess I wanted to hear and see if anyone already has had thoughts about this. I'm sure they have, and where you're at with that. Feel free to, write down your thoughts for yourself, and absolutely feel free to write in the chat box. I welcome hearing your own thoughts. Quote, your own thoughts. And it'll be great to integrate our collective ideas, especially in the sort of spirit of having a social justice approach, which will make sense in a minute. So feel free to type whatever you want. I'm going to throw stuff out there that I see in the chat box for everyone else to benefit from hearing. I'm sure you've heard of this, searched and created a word cloud. This is a fun new technology. I'm dating myself here. But here's what a lot of people think of when they think of social justice. Jennifer just wrote that for herself, social justice means discussing perspectives of equality in her classes. She's a professor. So there's two pieces there that are really relevant. One is just the word discussing, because that is a big part of social justice. It's not just teaching. There's this interactive, active piece that goes along with social justice that I think is one of the things that distinguishes it from just talking about different cultures and acknowledging multiculturalism and acknowledging diversity. There's a very active piece when we're talking about social justice. And then, of course, equality, and you see a lot of that here in this word cloud. We're thinking a lot and talking a lot and brainstorming a lot around how to tackle these challenges around equal access, equitable access, how to understand social oppression, various kinds of social oppression, what it means to, you know, acknowledge the role that racism, sexism, ageism, prejudice, um, how that affects individuals, groups, um, what we learn from our dominant culture, issues around socialization, but also just what we know about psychology and, how much does it apply to all individuals. So that's the, kind of research piece. So these are some of the terms you might associate with social justice. So just for the sake of time, again, just to reiterate, so what is a social justice approach? And again, you might come up with other stuff. I welcome seeing it. What you see here, active participation in the learning process, integration of critical inquiry and systems perspective. So some of what I might talk about and share might feel like, well, maybe you should just be a sociology professor. But then I think psychology is missing a lot of what impacts individuals' psychology and psychological phenomenon, which is social context and systems. So we want to integrate that more. We want to recognize the social construction of identity. Social structures matter, not just focus on intrapsychic factors. You're going to be thinking a lot about social action and advocacy. And we're going to talk about how this applies even in, psychology topics you may not think apply, like, of course, there's the sort of more general psych topics like social psychology that makes sense, community psychology, but even thinking about, neuropsychology and thinking about the brain sciences and thinking about developmental psychology, courses where you even research methods where you might not think, I can't really teach this class from a social justice approach. That's a different kind of field. But we can do it. And we're going to talk about some examples of that. So we're going to focus on historically marginalized and oppressed, not just include them as a sort of final chapter in the textbook. This is like integrating it as, as a primary topic within and throughout a course or a project or a research project. Emphasis on intersectionality, integration of dominant and majority group perspectives. That's true multiculturalism. So we're not just focusing on those groups that have been historically and are currently marginalized and oppressed, but we need to also understand the experiences of dominant and majority groups as well. And then another thing that really distinguishes this approach from other pedagogies and other frameworks is this personal commitment. It starts with you and your own thoughts about all of this and your own attitudes and your own self-awareness. And we're going to get to that in a few minutes as well. But having a personal commitment to seeing things from a social justice perspective is almost just as important as having a social justice approach and commitment professionally, or, in the field of psychology. So, that's a very sort of popular, common feminist kind of ideology or quote, the personal is political. In this case, what I would say is the personal is professional. Those two aspects of your thinking and life and understanding and experience are intertwined if you're going to have a social justice approach in psychology, education, and learning. So we're going to, try to foster and understand human development, health, and potential from a more broad lens or through a more broad lens. So before we get into, again, more specifics, I've mentioned a couple times I wanted to make sure that the distinction between some of these terms are clear, because I do think they're often used interchangeably. Diversity recognizes the broad scope of dimensions of race, ethnicity, language, sexual orientation, gender, age, disability, socioeconomic status, and class status, education. religious and spiritual orientation, and other cultural and social identity dimensions. Um, it's language is constantly evolving, so I know there are factors that I've left out there, um, but that's generally what we think of, and the focus really is on appreciating social differences, acknowledging and appreciating them, which is good and an important piece of this. It's not enough. So then I think of multiculturalism as kind of the next level, where our field, especially counseling psychology, and to an extent as well, clinical psychology, have been very focused. When we think of multiculturalism, we think of some people have called it the fourth force in psychology, which complements all the other sort of forces in psychology, psychodynamic, behavioral, and humanistic explanations of human behavior. Here, we're really focused on a wide range of multiple groups, without comparing or ranking them as better or worse than one another, but also without denying each group's distinct and complementary perspectives. So here, we're doing a little bit more than just recognizing and appreciating differences, diversity. Here we're actually trying to understand and learn about different groups, and not trying very hard not to value one group over any other group, or any one individual over any other individual for that matter, but also not denying and intentionally understanding and exploring each group's distinct and complementary perspectives. It's a response to what, we can probably talk endlessly about injustices that people experience across the world and across our country and across groups. And so multiculturalism proposes to redress disrespect by revaluing unjustly devalued group identities, while leaving intact both the contents of those identities and the group differentiations that underlie them. So here, there's not just acknowledging and appreciating and recognizing social differences. Here we are trying to understand the value of each group and their perspective and their experiences, revaluing each group, especially groups that have historically been devalued, minimized, left out. And so multiculturalism, that's the focus. Social justice goes beyond both of those important but slightly different approaches or perspectives. With social justice, we're moving beyond identifying and appreciating diversity. We're moving beyond building understanding of cultural and multicultural differences and experiences, hugely important. We're moving beyond integrating the significance of race and culture in theory, research, and practice. A social justice-informed psychologist seeks to transform the world, not just understand the world. There's that action piece, that active piece. Martin Baró is kind of thought of as a founder of liberation psychology, which we're going to talk a little bit about, because that informs a lot of some of the perspectives we're going to talk about. So we're trying to move away from psychology's traditional focus on the individual, but in a different way that, let's say, sociology, focuses. Psychologists themselves can perpetuate injustice by over-focusing on individual factors to explain social behavior, which abstracts the individual from important socio-historical contexts. And again, beyond even that, there's kind of what are we doing today to not just redress, not just understand and acknowledge, but redress some of those. So let's try to bring social justice more sort of directly in connection with psychology. This is nothing new. It's not like, the field of psychology has never and doesn't consider social justice at all. Of course, that's not true. I found some links that I'm happy to share that are in the notes to this PowerPoint presentation for, detailed but often overlooked history of social justice in psychology. For example, I don't know if you knew this, I didn't know this until recently, between 1920 and 1938, Free outpatient clinics in low-income neighborhoods were established across the country by early generations of politically active psychoanalysts. In 1944, the seminal social psychologist Kurt Lewin founded the Commission on Community Interrelations, the objective of which was to undertake action research on how to reduce prejudice. That was in 1944. So we have a long history of social justice intersecting with psychology, and in very active ways. Um, Not as much in these kind of ways that I want to talk about as far as bringing it into our classrooms, into undergraduate departments, and psychology majors. But the link between social justice and psychology is absolutely there. And we see it now in some other ways that I propose here, intersections with prevention, public policy, community psychology, certainly. In the counseling and clinical fields, for sure, there's been a lot of progress and growth in terms of expanding knowledge and training to be multiculturally sensitive and competent. But again, in terms of undergraduate psychology education, we might see it as a foundation for prevention. A lot of people do. It's a very prominent focus in community psychology. For example, a lot of community psychologists promote the use of social and behavioral science to enhance the well-being of people in their communities, to prevent harmful outcomes. A couple of authors, Kenny and Hage, in 2009 described prevention as, quote, an instrument of social justice. Social justice and advocacy can enhance prevention perspectives and actions by promoting and supporting practices and policies that empower people and reduce oppression. So, of course, there's those links with prevention. Now, conditions of social injustice like social conflict, exploitation of immigrants and other vulnerable groups are understood in terms of their implications for individual and group psychological health. This is where another intersection between social justice and psychology. We challenge those conditions instead of, accept them as inevitable. Social justice, so the role of science, psychological science, and individual as well as collective consciousness raising, is not just to understand, but to challenge those connections. Psychologists as teachers, researchers, therapists, consultants, etc., offer resources and knowledge that can contribute to social change. Social justice themes and principles that build psychological knowledge make it more inclusive, accessible, generalizable. So think of a lot of topics that we learn about, especially in intro and, more general areas in psychology like abnormal psych, personality psych, social psych, developmental psych. What are we learning in the classroom? How generalizable is it? How applicable is it to all groups and people? What is research based on that we're learning? Other ideas explored that I believe connect social justice with psychology, that what aspects of our human condition are assumed to be given, unchangeable, and what aspects are assumed to be changeable shapes in fundamental ways the nature of research, teaching, and practice in psychology. We look at issues of psychological adaptation. We look at research, teaching, and practice, which takes as a central focus of psychological work awareness of and possibilities for transforming conditions of social injustice, the psychological dimensions associated with the causes, consequences, and strategies needed to address social injustices, how choices individuals make on the collective level, as reflected by our economic, environmental, energy, military policies, for instance, and the implicit values and automatic assumptions that drive such choices significantly impact individual, family, and community mental health. So it's endless, the areas. How certain symptoms, especially those that manifest in epidemic proportions, like symptoms of ADD or depression in contemporary US culture, are simply medicated away rather than considered more deeply and responded to more appropriately on both an individual and societal level. So it's really expanding the focus of what we study, how we study it, what we teach, how we teach it. Those are the specifics we're going to get get into next. For the sake of time, I'm not going to say as much on this slide as I have developed a lot of sort of research around, or a lot of thoughts around, and done a lot of research. So again, that's available. But just again, there have been a lot of influential pedagogies and frameworks behind this idea of approaching psychology from a social justice perspective. And these include multicultural education, multicultural psychology, liberation psychology, which I mentioned, of course, feminist pedagogy and psychology, and then more generally, social justice education and training, which is something that you can find a lot of literature around, like in student life, higher ed kinds of literatures, and they've informed a lot of how we can apply those concepts in teaching different kinds of in teaching in different kinds of fields, not just psychology. I've mentioned liberation psychology. That's a huge influence here, in addition to feminist, even more than multicultural education and psychology, because again, these are the pieces that really helped evolve and move us beyond just having, understanding the importance of multicultural sensitivity and awareness. There's something a little different about social justice that certainly incorporates multiculturalism, but the pieces that we've gotten from liberation psychology and feminist psychology are what makes social justice unique. So very briefly, liberation psychology, again, originator was Ignacio Martin Baró, and he practiced psychology in the context of the El Salvador Civil War, himself becoming a victim of state repression. And the consequences of social conflict have since been an important theme for liberation psychology. Other areas of emphasis have been community and social psychology, with an emphasis on social movements, social and political commentary and critique. They've developed theories around developing critical consciousness about what's happening in, societies and the world around us, and how we need to understand those social contexts and challenge those social contexts, not just sort of how we're going to respond to them and cope. So liberating people from those sort of contexts of social oppression by empowering them, not only to challenge it, but to end those experiences of oppression. Liberation psychology became a response to criticisms of traditional psychology. Some talked about its social irrelevance. Was traditional psychology producing practical knowledge that addressed social problems either in the societies in which it was being developed or elsewhere? Lack of universal validity. Was psychology over-dependent on studies of particular populations in artificial settings? The imitation of scientific neutrality, which meant a denial of the moral dimension, a supposedly value-free position. Does that even exist? Restricted repertoire of investigation with a reliance on the methods of experimental psychology, a focus on the micro level, and a related dominance of individualistic ideology. So that's been a huge influence here. And again, I encourage you to learn more about these different frameworks and backgrounds, because then you'll really get what having a social justice approach means. So what does it mean to become a social justice oriented educator, researcher, mentor? And I'm thinking, again, in the context of undergraduate psychology education, I'm assuming that that's a primary focus for a lot of folks who were interested in this webinar. You're either a psych undergrad student, psych member, or you're a faculty advisor, and certainly then a teacher in a psych department, maybe do your own research. So that is the context that I'm thinking about this. So here's another opportunity that I wanted to take to hear from you. So If having a social justice approach is more than just a set of instructional techniques and research strategies, which it is, um, and it should be considered more of a philosophy, a way of looking at our society and the world from psychological perspectives. Remember that quote from Einstein at the beginning, the way we just think about the world and psychology. Um, and if by adopting a social justice approach, the field of psychology attempts to be more inclusive by empowering learners, creating a different kind of classroom climate, demonstrating genuine value in exploring opportunities to think critically and creatively about social experiences, psychological experiences. Take a moment to consider your own work, whether it's teaching, research, consulting, etc. Can you think of any strategies or approaches or activities you use that might be considered social justice oriented at this point? And then I'm eager to and excited to sort of share more specifics and continue to hear from you. But if you have any of your own thoughts or ideas, like, oh, I didn't think of that as being social justice oriented, now maybe things are coming to you like, well, maybe I do this. What do you think that would be, or what do you think that is? So feel free to jot down any of those ideas, and I would be happy to share those with the bigger group. Related to that I want you to be thinking about, which is hugely important, that having a social justice orientation starts with you. What do I mean by that? So in the multicultural field, we know that, or we have a very sort of well-researched and sort of evidence-based kind of critical component of clinical training, certainly, but having multiculturally competent psychologists involve three sort of broad areas of awareness, knowledge, and skills. Multicultural awareness, multicultural knowledge, and then multicultural skills. So in that vein, this awareness piece is hugely important. And by awareness, I'm referring to understanding personal biases and assumptions and the valuing of cultures different than one's own. It calls for individuals to understand how personal identities, experiences, and attitudes influence one's worldview and their interactions with people that are different from oneself. So, for now, reflect on things like your own attitudes and experiences, of course, including areas of privilege as well as marginalization. So what you might do at this stage, if you really want to sort of intentionally move towards saying, I am developing a social justice orientation to the way I practice, teach, research, and so on, you're going to learn about things like, if you haven't already heard, what is an area of privilege? What does that mean? How is that different from identities and areas of marginalization? And what are your own identities? And then connected to that, attitudes and experiences. On the attitudes, experiences of the people you work with. Well, actually, before that, in your personal life. I skipped one of the bullet points on my own notes. Again, remember your personal sort of commitment is hugely important here. So reflect on the attitudes and experiences of the people in your personal life, on the attitudes, experiences of the people you work with, including those you teach, if you're a professor or teacher, supervise and mentor, as well as your colleagues. And reflect on the social groups to which you belong and other salient dimensions of identity. That's the last point here. On that note, I have a slide for you to look at to understand, well, what does that mean? Dimensions, what are my social groups? What are my social identities? This is kind of what we're talking about, and you'll see how there's lots of layers here and things that are embedded within each other. According to Arredondo, and Gallor, this is a slide I came across. We can break them down into different dimensions that are embedded within each other. A dimensions, B dimensions, and then what we call C dimensions. So embedded in our history, historical eras and experiences and moments, are our B dimensions, our educational background, geographic location, even hobbies, recreational, relationship status, work experience, and those are embedded in our A dimensions, or our A dimensions are embedded in those, such as our age, our culture, our ethnicity, our race, our physical and mental well-being. So there's a lot to us. And if there's a lot to you as an individual, think of that in sort of intersection with or in interaction with all of the dimensions that everyone around you have. So you have to start with you and really think about and develop your own sense of self around these dimensions, what they mean to you, how they influence your experience in the world and of the world, how they shape the way others experience you, not just the way you experience things. While you're thinking about that, in the context of those 4 original questions, I see a couple of chats here. Let's see. Yeah, so having a child with who's autistic, and the way that your child has been treated poorly, um, the question or the thought is how teachers and school counselors need to work together to eliminate student marginalizing and oppression. Absolutely. Um, so this individual actually is an immigrant from Jamaica, uh, has been in the U.S. for many years, and has witnessed a lot of oppression. And what I think the most shocking from what I'm seeing in the chats is the experiences you've observed from people that should this should be their, how they, part of their training and part of the way they approach the people they work with and help and teach, and all of that makes sense. So again, starting with sort of your own sense of things, then we think about, yeah, this is what teachers and school counselors, what they should be doing. In what ways might your teaching or the way that you're sort of working with a student, let's say you're a school counselor, not just what's your awareness of self, but in what ways do you think that work I left out a word there, might shape or influence certain groups. How might your other roles and professional endeavors in your field, including your research, mentorship, consultation, be more or less inclusive of diverse perspectives and social groups? So for many instructors, the process of creating an inclusive classroom involves a close examination of their own attitudes toward race, class, and gender, and consequently assessing how these beliefs affect their work with others, their teaching. For example, professors may not ordinarily think about how students of color or from lower income backgrounds may be hesitant to challenge them during let's say, a Socratic dialogue, or even attend office hours because of their socialization and previous experiences with authority figures. So you need to start with reflecting on, well, how do I think of myself in all of these dimensions? How do I think of other people? And how do I think of how we are influencing each other, how that shapes our interactions with each other, how that shapes the way I approach my work, the way I approach clients, students, whatever it is. So let's jump into some ideas for application. And again, any thoughts that come to your mind, please, I welcome hearing about them on the chat. I'm going to actually present 4 ideas that I have, and try to sort of explain them a little bit, maybe talk about some examples. One is service learning. Then we're going to talk about research, of course, and then the classroom, integrating diverse perspectives and making curricula more inclusive, but also just pedagogy itself and how you teach or instruct. So let's start with service learning. For those of you who've never heard of service learning, what that means literally, and then we can talk about various examples, or maybe just a few for the sake of time. Experiential education in which learning is enhanced through volunteer work and reflection. From a social justice perspective, students volunteer with underserved or marginalized populations and connect to their site experiences to coursework. Again, there's that action piece. That's where social justice is not just about teaching folks about and talking about and studying group differences, let's say. It's doing something about the differences that you're observing, or when you're recognizing that some students are getting treated differently than other students. Or have a different life experience that's shaping the way that they're, understanding a class, taking a class. So individual and group service learning exercises can do things like reduce stereotypes. You're really getting folks out in the community, interacting with people that might be very different from them and who's in their world. Facilitates cultural and racial understanding, enhances civic responsibility. Offers students opportunities to apply newly acquired information outside of classroom settings. And it can be most successful when students have opportunities for reflection and critical analysis, maybe through written assignments, class discussions that tie course concepts with field experiences. So I'm going to read a couple of examples, but if you have any ideas, please, I would love to hear them. For example, assisting in hospitals or mental health facilities, tutoring at-risk children, volunteering in community centers that serve lower income populations, have students reflect on the challenges faced by the people they're working with and serving, and how those are connected maybe to social inequalities they're experiencing. Have students use psychologically relevant skills like completing a needs assessment or evaluating the effectiveness of a program. So they're using psychology in service of the work they're doing, but they're also learning about psychology through the work that they're doing in the community. Any thoughts or ideas about service learning? Or maybe some of you have been in a course where there was a service learning component. Maybe you have some ideas of your own that you would incorporate into a course you're teaching. So that's service learning. Again, we're going to move forward for the sake of time, but if something comes to you and we're not on this topic anymore, that's okay. I would love to hear about it. So the next idea for application, again, having a social justice-oriented approach to psychology, in the context of research, being more inclusive and having more inclusive opportunities and paradigms. So psychological research is not an unbiased venture, not immune from societal problems. For example, research on intelligence, as many of you probably already know, serve to reinforce stereotypes and discrimination against people of color. But it can also serve to build culturally contextualized knowledge and understanding. So this is something that many subfields like Black psychology, liberation psychology, as I mentioned before, feminist, multicultural psychology, developed in part to challenge researchers to advance social justice topics, ideas, understandings, and not recreate inequities. More specifically, researchers have established qualitative methodologies that I think are really aligned with having this kind of perspective on conducting research and in what we're trying to learn and how we're trying to learn that. So the sort of opportunity that qualitative inquiry offers to develop culturally contextualized knowledge, promote dialogue, centralize the lived experiences of marginalized populations. So you're not applying, let's say, a questionnaire that was developed on one population to another population. benefit marginalized communities, examine the systemic injustices that perpetuate certain experiences. So it's just another tool, another kind of research method. Now, students learn to conduct quantitative studies and research methods courses. Instructors most often rely on quantitative findings to inform their lectures. So you can make a choice about being more intentional in what you're presenting to them, as an example of doing this kind of regression analysis, or developing a questionnaire and test construction. What kind of examples are you using when you're choosing what problems to study, what populations to study, what procedures and measures to use? How are you thinking about that, and thinking about the makeup of the people in your courses, but also what they're learning about, the people in their world, and even, in conducting research itself. How are you thinking about the questions that you're researching, and in what ways are you doing that? Are they the most inclusive ways? There's one particular research methodology that you may or may not have heard of, called participatory action research. And that's a research methodology that grounds the research in community participation and action. It involves research participants themselves in every step of the process, from conceptualizing the research questions to collecting and analyzing data, and to co-developing conclusions and recommendations. So the theory and knowledge gained through this kind of collaboration is grounded in context. And it actually then, hopefully, the goal is to promote change and empower not only researchers, but participants and community members themselves. From a very basic standpoint, you can strive to make research findings just more broadly accessible. Where are you trying to publish articles that you've written? Who are the audiences of those, journals? So you can, what do you know about open science? What do you know about publishing things online that are more accessible to more people all over the place? So just sort of, again, there's what you do, but there's how you think about what you're doing. That's part of what it means to be a social justice oriented. And you can insert the word there. On that note, how do you think about integrating intent, what kind of curricula you develop? What goes on your syllabus if you're a professor? What do you look for in a class if you're a student? What do you want to learn about? What do you want to teach? Just as there's no value neutral research, there's no value neutral course content or classroom practice. So for example, so the kinds of things you would be aiming to do are listed here on this slide. And then I'd like to talk about some examples of how this would look in different kinds of courses. But what you're trying to do is help students see themselves in relation, not only to themselves, but their immediate relationships and contexts, to the broader sociocultural and contextual world they live in. You're trying to make course content more inclusive. And this could be through what textbooks you choose, what materials you use, sources that address a diversity of perspectives, worldviews, and research findings. Of course, seek out new connections that relate course topics to issues of social importance and inequalities. Use multiple methods of assessment and evaluation of student performance that might help promote equity in the classroom. People learn differently. Do you know about universal design, UDL, universal design learning? Again, that's beyond the scope of this webinar, but are you interested in seeking out, well, what is that? How would I develop my course to be universally designed? So, for example, if you look at these courses here, I'm going to give you some sort of an example of what might be a social justice oriented topic to teach. But before I go on, if you're watching this later on, if you're watching this now, any ideas come to your mind? If I were teaching this in front of a live audience, that's where I would start. Because again, remember, I'm also trying to approach even just this webinar from a social justice perspective. And I think you have just as much to offer as I do. I'm just trying to give you sort of a framework for it, a way to think about it, some language to use around it. So, developmental psychology. Here's a question you might explore in that class. How does a lack of safe neighborhoods affect children's well-being? In an IO class, industrial organizational psychology, what are the effects of gender-based pay inequities on corporate climate? In an abnormal psych class, how does social class shape access to psychological and psychiatric services? It's just sort of adding in those perspectives, not just teaching, the DSM in abnormal psych, and, all the different disorders, just sort of thinking more broadly about things. In a learning cognitive psych course, how can principles of operant and classical conditioning be used to change attitudes toward members of ostracized groups? What about for biopsychology? When you're teaching some history there, why were lobotomies performed disproportionately on women? Personality? Are the big five personality dimensions universal given the role of gender and culture in identity formation? Do they apply, the big five? I teach personality psych, but do they apply universally? If so, how? How do we know that? So again, these are just some examples, but I encourage you to think about, your own ideas. Here's another sort of example way of thinking about what we'd consider more traditional psych concepts, and how we would try to think of them from a more social justice informed way, or from a social justice perspective. So this was presented in an article by Watts in 2004. Here are some conventional concepts in psychology on the left side of the table, reconceptualized into key ideas from population-specific psychologies on the right side. So I'm going to sort of skip past some of the pieces at the top there, but let's go to one example here. The term self-efficacy. Recent research has mapped this person-centered concept onto community functioning and termed it collective efficacy. When scaled up even more, these concepts address the social context of behavior. So the target of intervention in social justice work is the social context. Scaling existing concepts so that they address social processes is one way that old ideas can be harvested in the service of, in this case, liberation psychology. That's kind of what you're seeing a little bit of on the right side there. So here's another example there. Liberation at the societal level is analogous to what conventional personality theorists call self-actualization, a term that emphasizes individual development over social development. Psychology would be quite different if there was as much research on social liberation as there is on self-actualization and similar notions of personal development. So you see that sort of group social context piece being added to our idea of the individual concept piece. And this is more heavily, of course, focused on liberation psychology concepts. But I thought this was another good example of what I mean by sort of rethinking things, or thinking of things from a different perspective, things that we think are just the way they are. You teach what self-efficacy means. You explore, self-actualization, but is it from, just one sort of perspective? Finally, more specific ideas for integrating pedagogy and experiential learning that empowers students. Use community experiences to augment in-class learning. Have students draw on prior out-of-class or in-class community experiences to increase student understanding. Create campus-based action-oriented assignments to promote social justice. You can even have students develop and engage in social action projects. It's increasingly important for psychology students to understand the connections between research practice and public policy. So these links often have social justice implications, creating class assignments that can impact others on a political level, such as having students explore pending state and federal legislation, and to advocate for disenfranchised people by writing opinion editorials or letters to legislators citing research relevant to policy. So there's a lot of, and I have some more resources in my notes here that I hope can be accessible to you. But take a moment to put your social justice lens on and see what you come up with for, again, these kind of more classic courses. Students in a Psychology of Women course organize a Take Back the Night demonstration on campus. Developmental psych, child development students lobby university officials for the creation of a subsidized on-campus childcare center. Social psychology students create a new campus organization to promote interfaith and interracial dialogue and invite community leaders to catalyze discussions. IO, students organize a protest of a megastore that engages in unfair labor practices and gender bias in its hiring and pay. Research methods students conduct a campus-wide survey of attitudes toward LGBT students and present their analyses to university officials to support programming that promotes tolerance and inclusiveness. So because we're almost out of time, I'm actually at the end, I'm towards the end. I wanted to just talk about, there's the why. This is an important piece that we started with. There's some how, and, for the scope of this webinar, it was impossible to really get into a lot of that. And there's a lot more out there and resources that I hope you'll seek out. This is another how. What would it mean to use egalitarian teaching methods? And I wanted to offer some ideas around that. That would be sort of having a social justice approach to teaching. So social justice can also be promoted by how you teach, regardless of what you teach. Instructors who are concerned with social justice often question conventional notions of authority in college classrooms because it may parallel or reinforce how power is exercised more broadly in society. For example, Freire, he's a very popular theorist in liberation psychology, criticized the banking model of instruction in which professors maximize their control by exclusively determining course content and relying on lectures to transfer information. So instead, if you think about having a more social justice approach, that would encourage students to have greater input and control. It underscores the importance of students' values, priorities, beliefs in the teaching and learning process. On a practical note, Enns and Sinecor recommend more specific recommendations, something called responsive goal setting. Provide students with a voice in deciding which topics are emphasized within the course. Cooperative learning. Encourage students to interact with others, especially those who have different backgrounds, through problem-based learning, laboratory exercises, group activities. Integrate instructor self-disclosure as appropriate. Model openness. That's a really social justice sort of ideologically part of this approach. So other ideas you have in creating an ethical, socially just classroom, throw it out there. I do have one message here. When one particular race experienced the disparity, individual or group oriented. Yeah. So if a race experiences disparities, I don't know if you're talking about racism or particular, that would be group oriented for sure. An individual experiences discrimination or might experience oppressive, experiences. But that's an individual. The group as well, it's a group and individual phenomenon, certainly in education. Yes. So, for example, something I've taught in my classes about expectancy effects and personality. I, because I haven't really thought about some of my own biases, and haven't thought about how I might just sort of interact with, grade, teach, and see a student um, by what I see and the assumptions I make about that student. So I might not call on, or not I might assume that someone of, who I perceive to be of one ethnicity or race, I might treat them differently in these subtle ways that I'm not even aware of, than a student who I just sort of have these different expectations of, that they're more going to be automatically more engaged. They're going to know what they're doing. And so I'm already just even thinking of them differently. I'm going to read their papers differently. I'm not going to call on one as much. I'm not going to sort of follow up with one student as much as I would with another. That can be hugely harmful to certainly that student, but that's part of a group level disparity that is well documented in the literature. So I don't know if that answers your question, one of the participants here, but it's both individual and group level in education settings. Microaggressions, I'm going to let you look at these on your own, these last couple of slides, but I'm almost finished, but wanted to end with a few additional concepts that I do think are relevant and important in the context of having a social justice approach. So maybe you've already heard of this form of discrimination called microaggressions. It's kind of related to the example I was just using, in terms of teaching and approaching students differently. So how one views the world, especially when it comes to race relations and racial interactions, serves as a prism from which data and information are filtered. This could be racial microaggressions. We could be talking about gender, sexual orientation microaggressions. There's different forms there that I sort of briefly mention on the slide: indirect, subtle. Of course, they're unintentional. They could be verbal and behavioral. They can be very overt. They can be very subtle and even hidden. But they're usually considered kind of small and, not the same thing, certainly, as what we would sort of consider more sort of blatant discrimination. But they can be almost as harmful, especially in accumulation. Studies show that they significantly impact the mental health of recipients, causing anger, frustration, low self-esteem. They can create a hostile and invalidating campus or work climate, perpetuate stereotype threat, create physical health problems, lower work productivity and problem-solving abilities. So a lot of consequences, pretty damaging consequences. So this would be another example of what you, as a social justice-oriented, educator, researcher, student, would want to learn more about. And when am I experiencing microaggressions? I never thought of it that way. I never thought of how they could be harming me. And when am I acting in such a way? Did what I just say, is that an example of a microaggression? Unintentional. So somebody just wrote, I question if they're unintentional, or if they're more, and therefore more macro. If I'm understanding your question correctly, I do think a lot of times it's unintentional, but that's what's so powerful and important about them, because we don't even know we're doing it. And that's why this self-awareness piece is so important, to really just sort of want to learn more and understand more. And the more you learn and read, the more you'll catch yourself, and the more you'll catch it and learn how to assert that was hurtful to you, or that was invalidating, or whatever it is that happened. So responses, some examples I have in my slides. Be honest with ourselves. Be willing to own up to our inevitable socialized and internalized racial, gender, sexual orientation, other biases. Support and become familiar with the research that demonstrates how oppressive microaggressions can be, how they create disparities in society, contribute to psychological stress and distress. Don't invalidate the experiential realities of diverse groups in our society. Be open to discussing, exploring, clarifying when someone, you know, sort of states that they feel that you've engaged in a microaggressive remark or behavior. Finally, cultural humility. So this is a concept that I've come across more so in the context of teaching counseling and being a therapist. You can't know it all. You won't know it all. That's not the point of this. Certainly not after one webinar, and I'm sure you've engaged in a lot of other kinds of experiences. There's no way you're going to learn everything you need to know. And if we start from the concept of humility at a base level, a stance of not knowing, acceptance of the inability to know everything, and respect for others who do know, if we extend that, and that has been extended to having cultural humility, that involves an individual's recognition of gaps in knowledge about a particular culture, limitations of understanding others' culture and experiences. It's impossible to completely understand someone else's experiences, and an other-oriented interpersonal stance, then that might be a big part of this. Not just kind of learning everything you need to know, and then you're going to do it this way. Like, I now can be a social justice educator. That's just not possible, and that's not the point. It's really, again, about a way of thinking. It's about a perspective. It's about just an approach, and that's lifelong. So perhaps we can call it social justice humility. So I'm not going to show this clip because I know we're well over time. But I came across very recently this TED Talk by a Nigerian author here named Chimamanda Adichie. And she talks about the danger of the single story. And I thought this was completely relevant to what I've been talking about. I wish we could watch this clip together, the whole talk together, but for the sake of time, I just want to tell you about it. And you just have to Google the danger of the single story, and you'll be able to see her whole talk, or just the clip I was going to show, which captures some of what I think Einstein meant in the first quote, and what we kind of have been talking about, and what we should aspire to in developing a social justice approach. As she explains, our lives, our cultures are composed of many overlapping stories. She tells the story of how she found her authentic cultural voice, and warns that if we hear only a single story about another person or country, we risk a critical misunderstanding. In her talk, she describes the problem, explaining the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So I'm going to end on that note. And I'm going to, I guess, for the sake of the webinar, I'm going to stop the recording now. I hope that you got something useful out of this. Maybe you can go back and look at some of the slides. And I'm happy to share what I've been putting together and what I've been learning. You can certainly email me, and I'm happy to share this PowerPoint presentation with you. And talk further. I'm the PsyChi Diversity Director, so you can easily find my contact information on the PsyChi website, and we can talk more if you'd like to. I will hang around a little bit after I stop recording if anyone has any other questions or wants to say anything. Thank you again for watching.